Hello.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful introduction, and thank you for the earlier speakers. What a tough act to follow tonight.
Yeah.
Amazing inspiration.
They've been brilliant,
Thank
yeah.
you for having me.
Well, not at all. Thank you very much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm well.
You've warmed
Yeah.
up a little bit from the, it was a bit cold, wasn't it, coming in
Yeah,
here?
it was. But I didn't drink any tequila from your room, just
No,
saying.
that's where
I withheld myself for now.
for now. Well, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I thought maybe just to start with, it'd be great to go back to the beginning. I mentioned that you were you grew up in Beirut. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that was like, and I guess when you first realized that you had an eye for design or kind of creative streak?
Yeah. That was a while ago. I'm not a Gen Zer, I'm afraid. So I grew up in Lebanon during the time that is now called the Civil War, but back then they didn't really call it Civil War, they called it the events of 72, the events of 75, so like whenever things happened. And it was a turbulent time in terms of like the outside context in a way. But as a child, you don't really understand perhaps the sort of context in terms of political. You just feel the anxiety of your parents and the anxiety of the people around you. And when I was a child, I used to find a lot of joy in just kind of sitting down and drawing or thinking of something and making it out of paper. I remember I was maybe 7 or 8, I decided I wanted to make like a pop-up house in a little notebook. It was summarizing a French book that I read, so we had to do these summaries of books that we read. So, and I didn't really, maybe I didn't know what pop-up was, but I just thought I'll have a go. I had this like idea in my head. And I spent, I don't know how many hours just doing it. And when it was finished, and it looked really rubbish, but for me it looked like the biggest achievement in the world. And maybe it's that moment that I try to create in design, so somehow it's just the engagement in the creative flow and just carving a little space where you can play and be engage with color and shapes and forms. It was like a safer space for me, I think. This is perhaps the moment where I knew like creative stuff are enjoyable. And it's a purely selfish like motivation. That's where.
But it's interesting. I mean, like even as adults, we kind of are always trying to find that kind of childish sense of play, right? And trying to you can be so focused on something at that age, and really committed to something. Whereas now we kind of find we're easily distracted, perhaps, from that kind of creative journey. Yeah.
And it's hard to carve out 2 to 3 hours in your day to actually do that. But it is enjoyable when it happens, and it's like the term creative flow is a thing, like you read about it in books of sociology and psychology, even if it's in writing or music, but somehow you just engage in something and you're not really putting any limitations on what you're trying to do. Yeah. And there is a sense of achievement when you kind of achieve it and get it done. You have something in your head that materializes, quite rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And did you grow up in a kind of creative or a design household? Was there design around you a lot of the time, or
not at all?
Okay.
Not at all. I was the odd one out. I had a friend who used to use his siblings as props for his fashion show. My siblings were not interested. My whole household was not really creative, and actually, in a context that's quite difficult at the time. Even in school, like we used to have to cover time, so all the creative sessions would go to be replaced to make up the math lessons we lost when we weren't at school. So actually I had no access maybe up until I was 17. There was no museums where I grew up. I read a lot, but that's about it. Like I don't think I was not surrounded. I didn't even have role models. So to end up here talking to you guys, I don't know how that happened, but just maybe an accident, who knows?
Not at all, not at all. And I guess what age did you then come to the UK, and what was that like? What was that move like for you?
So I got a scholarship after I graduated from college. I worked for a while, and I applied for a scholarship in 2004. We got it in 2005, and I had a year to live in the UK where I could choose a master's degree, do whatever I want, and just explore a different city. And it was really exciting time, enriching time. And then I remember very clearly, like there were few kind of major themes in that transition, in the sense, at the time I was very fluent in English, but I arrived and I kind of kept feeling like I'm not really understanding what was going on. And it wasn't an issue of language, it was more an issue of culture. So I wasn't tuned into maybe the humor or the silences. Like, Lebanese people are very loud, they're very opinionated, they tell you everything they're thinking, even if you don't ask. They comment on your appearance, they just really... While here the culture is quite different. Actually, if people don't like something, they don't say anything. So you have to watch the silences as opposed to listening to the words. And the humor as well. The humor is like the highest form of intelligence. But you could really understand a language very well, but not necessarily really read the humor. It takes a while to tune in to that. The other thing I really liked about London was the anonymity it gives you. So coming from a place that's very kind of tribal, in a sense that you're not an individual, you are the daughter of so-and-so, you belong to this family, you belong to this kind of religious group, you are supposed to have these thoughts, there's a lot of limitations and expectations on who you are. Mm-hmm. Then you come to this massive city and nobody knows you, and it's great. Because you can really reinvent yourself, or be whoever you want to be, or actually even start asking yourself who you want to be. So I found that to be, although it was very scary, right? Like, because you're alone, you don't have any family, you want to do stuff maybe that you don't necessarily know how to get a mortgage, how to do X, Y, and Z, like in terms of like the normal day-to-day things. But at the same time, the anonymity, this blank page that you can, recreate whoever you want to be. I found that to be quite exciting. I didn't completely rebrand myself. Maybe I did a bit of a brand uplift, if we're talking branding terms, but that's...
Just a little rebrand,
yeah.
Just a small one, not a, not a full overhaul like you might do at Pentagram.
Yeah.
You then worked as a set designer, I think, for quite a few years, working with the director and playwright Rabih Mroué.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I've said that right.
That's right.
Apologies. I'm intrigued, how did that collaboration begin? Because it's, it seems like it's been a very fruitful collaboration for many years. And I'm kind of interested as well, how does that side of your practice maybe influence the design side that you work on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the collaboration started as a total accident. We were having small talk, like I knew of him and of his work. So I was like, yeah, what are you working on at the moment? And he said, well, I'm doing this new play. I'm like, do you need help? Like, I was just kind of curious and eager and young. And he said, yeah, what do you do? And I said, I'm a designer. He's like, oh, you can do the set design. I was like, set design, how far is that from design? He's like, well, it's kind of pretty much the same thing. Yeah, you can do it. So I'm like, okay. I tried to kind of like pretend that I can do it. And then I go back to the office and I tell my friend, okay, this guy just asked me to do the set design. I have no idea how to do this. Will you help me? Like, will we do it together? And for the first 6 months, and clearly I was doing it as a volunteer. I was not going to take any money for this because it was not, something I could sell, technically. I cannot say to someone, here you go, I can be your set designer. But the great thing about this collaboration is that he had a habit of working with people that were not specialists in their field. He actually worked with actors who were not actors, and he worked with set designers or whatever, like collaborators he collaborated with were not trained. And he did that on purpose because he felt that those who are trained are perhaps too rigid in their style. While if you work with people, if you know what you want and you work with people who don't know what they're doing, sometimes you fall on like these haphazard accidents that you might like. So I started working on this first performance, and clearly like I was doing like hundreds of sketches, trying to over-deliver just to compensate for my ignorance. I had probably been to one theater before I did this job. Like we worked for 6 months. Half the time, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm winging it anyway, and I'm just thinking, okay, it's gonna be fine. And he was great. He was kind of quite relaxed about it all. And then we do the first show, and it opens, and no catastrophes happened. And I thought, okay, this is good, okay? I mean, you take on a job that you don't know what to do. I feel like it's a great way to actually expand your knowledge set. But at the same time, there's also another thing that comes into it, which is like working outside your comfort zone. And this is where most of the learning happens, like when you just don't know what you're doing, but you're doing it anyway. And shortly after this, he came to me and he's like, oh, we've just been invited to the ICA in London, to Berlin, and to Hanover, and you're coming. And I'm like, are you serious? Do I get to go? And he was like, yeah, you know, you're the team. You're part of the team, so we're all going. So I ended up coming to London for the first time in 2003, invited as a set designer on an artist. So this career ended up being more serious than my design career, way before my design career became serious. Right. And the beauty of this, like kind of continuing to work, we did about seven performances together over a period of 10 years, 12 years. I learned so much from this, like we ended up traveling a lot, getting invited to a lot of festivals, seeing a lot of work, learning about stories that maybe relate to people, stories that people want to tell, how they receive them. We could also see like the live aspect of performance makes you see people's reaction in real time, which is not something we get to see as graphic designers. We put stuff online and then people comment, but that's about it. You don't get to see an angry person saying, why don't you have any actors on the stage? So there's a huge element in that. There's also like the responsibility of like putting the same set in different places, communicating with different technicians of different cultures, but you also have to turn up always like with the same performance. And this is where like all the kind of cultural like, you know, you realize how, so for example in Korea, I remember we would go to the theater, we had like about 4 days to set up, go to the theater every day, and we see they haven't set up anything. And we would explain the set again, and they say yes, of course, and they're super polite. We come back the next day, nothing's happened. Then we realized after 2 days or 3 days, someone told us they don't say no. This is a culture where they don't tell you no. So they want to say no, but I think they misunderstood something. There was like a whole thing lost in translation. Eventually, we managed to kind of resolve it. This whole thing of like precision versus who's precise, who works via approximation. Even like during the show, the jokes that people laugh at in certain places can be sometimes the opposite, or they can make other cultures maybe a bit uncomfortable. So it's kind of maybe like throughout this journey of 10 years, this is where I started to tune into the variety that we are as human beings, and how interesting that can be sometimes. And how when we work, we sort of work from our own position as who we are, but that some stories have a bigger, like travel better, some humor doesn't travel, some humor travels well, and all of these kind of nuances that come into this.
So interesting. I mean, it's all part of this kind of education you had, I guess,
yeah.
of like how different cultures are different and how there's the tensions in them. Yeah. That kind of, I guess, started when you first came to London.
And also the exposure was invaluable, like just, you know, performance, modern performance. And also one thing to say, like I wasn't doing, the work of this specific director is very much to do with the documents, imagery. So his work is very visual. It's kind of a cross between visual arts. We use a lot of tech. And sometimes you have performances that have like 3 screens on stage or 2 screens on stage. So it's not really actually building a whole Shakespearean context. It's more contemporary in its approach. And the performance festivals we were invited to were all kind of contemporary performance. So, you know, I've seen such great work that I wouldn't have had access to had I not volunteered in this one moment in time. So that's like, you know, talking about free internships or things you do sometimes for free, like you never know where they lead.
Yeah, absolutely. But was there a part of you that wanted to be a stage designer or a set designer, or what was it about graphic design that then kind of lured you back?
I never stopped. Like in a sense, like what I was doing was graphic design for the performance, because there were always posters and like, you know, the set of documents, a sequence of images. But the added element is you add it into 3D, like into a space, like a stage, and you build a sequence of images also in real time. So like what people enter and see, and then how you destroy whatever you have on stage, and then how you rebuild it. So it's kind of like the same. It's not really that difficult because I'm not building sets that are, in a way, like more complicated. I was doing sets that are basically a sequence of images in real time in space.
Right.
So I didn't see it as a sort of difference.
Right. All part of the same practice, I guess.
Yeah. And I wouldn't probably go to be a set designer for someone whose work is more elaborate in terms of set design production. I still don't take myself seriously as a set designer, although, it was, because I worked with one director, so it was more like, a creative collaboration with one person whose maybe creative vision I understand and I'm interested in. But I don't know, I don't think I would go for that job.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like an amazing collaboration over many years.
Yeah, and he's become really big. He's won awards. His work is in Tate, in MoMA, everywhere. So, so I think people knew me from my work in set design before they knew me from my work in graphic design.
Right.
But I mean, that's okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't take the direct road to get somewhere. I guess like my career is more like a bumper cars sort of exercise than a straight line.
That's a very nice way of thinking about it. I've never heard that analogy. I like it. I mean, I guess let's come on to the graphic design, because obviously we've got lots of images of your work behind us here. And I wanted to start with, around, I think, 10 years ago, you designed the Citywide tourist brand for Dubai, which is still in use today, which is quite unusual that it hasn't gone through another rebrand. It's really stood the test of time. Could you talk us through that project and I guess the steps that led to that final piece of work, that final delivery?
So I did that project. I was a senior designer, I think, at the time with MC Saatchi, and they won the bid to do the brand, but what they were more interested in doing actually the campaign. So for them, doing the brand was a way to get the campaign for the city. And the brief changed over time from being a tourism brand to being a city brand. So the difference is a tourism brand is telling people come and visit Dubai. The city brand also starts to cover the taxis, the transport, the sort of ministries. So all through that process, we were going through all these brief changes. It was a very complicated process, lots of people involved. Everybody had opinions on everything: color, typography, English, Arabic. Even if they didn't read Arabic, they still had an opinion. It was kind of really layered, and we went through hundreds of iterations, I think, for this project. But what was interesting is I think this is where I started to kind of see a little bit what I'm trying to achieve. Because the setup of a project also influences the output. So if you have the right people involved in doing the project, you get a better output. And in this case, part of the difficulty of running this project was a bit of like loss of translation between people. So sometimes we had good ideas that we lost because people couldn't read them, or they thought they wanted to check the legibility, so they would turn to their assistant who reads Arabic, who's maybe their PA, not necessarily their marketing director. And they'd say, does that read, does that not read? And then you lose stuff and you go back and forth. Eventually, the mark that we landed on kind of came up really towards the end of the process. And it was a compact mark. So typically, when you have a bilingual project, you end up doing an English version, Arabic version, a bilingual version. That means 3 faces for your brand instead of 1. And actually, in this solution, we proposed 1 face for the brand that lives in one place, and it could easily sit on a car number plate. And I believe someone told me, even today, people still pay $200 to put the logo on their car number plate. I wish I charged license fees. Like, what do you mean? Like the
license plate.
Yeah, exactly. Like you license it per usage. I would have been rich. I mean, this is kind of what they were after, and it was the beginning of thinking about how can you integrate languages, or how can you actually think of ways to, instead of having 3 different faces for every brand, can you have 1? Is there a way to have 1 that's consistent across the board? And I think that's perhaps why this has lived on. There are things I don't like about this brand, so that's why, Okay. I'm just going to stop here. There's lots of things I wanted to tweak, but then, I didn't have enough power on that team at the time and this advertising, so it's what it is.
Okay. I mean, let's telescope forwards now, I guess, to 2021, when you set up your own studio, Right to Left, which we talked about. I talked about in the introduction. What was it that made you want to set up your own agency? I mean, what were you finding, or not finding, I guess, out in the wider design world that you wanted to kind of write? And I guess some of these themes have probably already come up in a couple of your answers already.
Yeah. So it was after lockdown. I think everybody felt after lockdown that we wanted to change. By then, I had been in London enough time to feel like I could set up a studio. I've always wanted to run my own thing. So it was just a combination of things that I felt it was the right time. And I felt I could do it. That was before I looked at the statistics of studios run by women in London. Because, I mean, good thing I did it before, because maybe if I looked at the stats, I'd be like, I wonder why that is. Like, the numbers are really low. And I suppose part of what I was trying to do is to set up this method of co-creating instead of looking at working with another language as a localization exercise. So you do it in English first and then you do it. And it was constant. In every project I did, I found myself saying, but have you thought about, you know, starting from this language? Because actually the construction of the script is different. So for example, there's no uppercase in Arabic. Very often you get someone who's like, oh, I've come up with this great idea, can you do it in Arabic? And it's all uppercase, and you're having to extend the X height of the Arabic. But Arabic is actually a horizontal language, it's not very vertical. So you're forcing it. So you're kind of trying to force these solutions to fit into a mold that doesn't really work for the script. But being able to speak and sort of design in both scripts, you can actually very quickly start from somewhere that you know will work and travel well. And that's sort of what I was trying to do. And part of having a studio, so for me it was like, okay, can I expand this method? Can I work with people who speak other scripts and perhaps look at how it's done in other places? And that was really the intention behind the studio.
And I guess what does your design or creative process look like? And how does that differ from maybe, I don't know, the design process that doesn't come from that same perspective that you're talking about? What does it look like to kind of start a project?
So I think it's very similar to any designer. We start from typefaces, we have a name, we kind of think. The difference is that maybe I have a little more tools to work with, which is the script. I've also, I like accidents, just like Angela earlier. I think I've discovered this while working with, sometimes I would be working with teams that don't speak Arabic, and I found that sometimes it helps if I give them, okay, so these are the letters, this is what the positioning of the brand is, play. And don't worry, that you can make as many mistakes as you want. So just generate. And I remember I was working at Pentagram maybe 5 or 6 years ago with a good designer called Jess, and Marissa, I think, and they were both kind of toying with this brand identity for a magazine for women, and it was all in Arabic. And they're like, actually, we're enjoying this, you know, we're just playing, and they generated like a whole board of ideas, and it was great because you see sometimes in not knowing, it frees them from the burden of does this look good or does this look bad, and allows them to play. And I could find like some really good iterations that I probably wouldn't have gone there. And sometimes all you need to do is turn the letter a little bit, or just like kind of just to make it correct. So it's like, okay, I want to do more of that. There's something freeing in doing a bit of a ping pong sometimes. So that's maybe something I like to play with. And I don't think it works for all designers. Some designers find it really uncomfortable to work with a script they cannot read. But some designers enjoy it. They just like, sometimes they say, well, this looks like an elephant. There's like 2, 3 letters and it looks like an animal. Like it's shapes, right? We're all playing with shapes and forms. And it's what can you do with these shapes and how far can you push them? So yeah.
I mean, you talked about play there and used that word a couple of times. And I was just kind of struck by how it echoes what you were talking about earlier when you were a 7-year-old and playing with a kind of pop-up house. But I mean, tell me a bit about how play, I guess, functions within the studio, how much you're using it and how you're using it. And I guess what influence it has on the work that you do, because it feels like it's a very important part of your process.
Well, I think as children, we are probably less burdened by right and wrong. And that makes everything possible. Like it sort of opens the horizons. And yes, with clients in a design environment that is not, very possible. But I try to make space at the beginning of every project when everything is nice and dandy, where we can actually play. I try to use that time to do a bit of play, to see if we can come up with things that are not thinking, we're trying not to think about what the client wants, we're trying to think how far can we take this. And in every presentation I do, I always kind of present the route that I think the client wants, which is usually the first safe route. And then in the middle, something that maybe is more of a leap, maybe a step from the first route. So you can go a bit far, and then the route that we come up with in the play is like the craziest route in the end, but I put it in the end after they've kind of seen and they never go for it, unfortunately. I've never had a client say, okay, let's be brave. But sometimes it does, sometimes it does work out. They usually love it, but it depends on, who you're working with, what's their appetite to do something out there or not. It will happen. We have loads of these sketches that are sitting there. Sometimes if it's a complex structure within the client, you need to get consensus. So then, people are less likely to be more risky in their approach. So usually at the early stages of every project, there's room to do that. And once something is selected, it's more about the craft and the kind of refinement and the detail within it.
I want to come on to some of the audience questions in a second, but maybe just as a final question, you've spoken about lazy visual stereotypes in the past, and I guess I'm interested in the context of design and maybe in branding as well. What does a stereotype look like? What does a lazy stereotype for you look like, and how do we avoid them as designers as well?
So, stereotypes are everywhere. Every culture has a stereotype. I'm not going to list them, so I don't want to offend anyone. But I suppose when it comes to, for example, Arabic-speaking countries, people often assume that it's one thing, or like maybe they make the confusion between if you speak Arabic, then you must be Muslim. That's not true. Arabic covers 24 countries that have Arabic as an official language. This is from between the north of Africa all the way to the Arab Peninsula to the Levant. And all these people are very different people. And even the language itself is very different between all these geographies. One stereotype that you see a lot when people are working with this area and they kind of say, oh, we didn't know what to do, so we'll give them a pattern. But everybody has a claim on pattern. We don't own pattern. Like, everybody can use a pattern. That's like one of those things that has been overused just because people don't want to engage with the nuance and perhaps the complexity of this area. They're complex areas. The news coming out of this area is not perhaps always easy to digest or to understand. But if you want to work in to be really authentic or genuine, you have to look a little bit deeper, or at least use the script. Like, the script is so varied, and you have scripts that come from all of these different geographies. So there's a lot to work with beyond pattern. So yeah, if someone tells me I want a pattern in a new meeting, like new client meeting, I'll be like, no, no, we're not working with this guy.
Big red alarm just starts going, in your head. Maybe one final question, just because I wanted to touch on this project, 29 words for 29 letters, which is, I think we've seen some of the visuals behind us as we've been speaking. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because it's such a lovely idea and a really nice project to talk about.
So this started from me having to translate some words repeatedly. In my life in London. Some of them are related to typography, for example, like, someone would say, if I show a shape for a brand mark or something, is that serif or sans serif? I'm like, what doesn't exist really in the script? Serif is actually quite different. You have, nasakh, kufi, maghribi. You have like 12 different calligraphic styles. But then I started doing these presentations to contextualize and to say, well, we don't have vowels, we have like diacritics. This is what the diacritics does, so like little 101 of the script. And then another word in like my day-to-day life, and they say like if you don't have a word for something, it doesn't exist for you. So if you didn't have a word, for example, for the color red, then we don't see red, or we can assume that we don't see red. We invented the word to be able to, because we see it. So it's like this word that I always translated to people, which is a smell. It describes a smell. It doesn't exist in English or any of the European languages. And it describes a smell that the fish leaves on a plate after you wash it if you didn't use lemon or coffee. Because you have to, because, you know, fish, and it's not just fish, it also can be from eggs or chicken. And, you know, for us, it's a big deal. Like, if you smell this on a plate, it's not good. So if you're not really using like serious chemicals or like lemon to be able to wash your plates, you smell it. Sometimes I would smell it in restaurants on a glass of wine, or it stays, it lingers. So I found myself explaining, okay, this, use lemon, no. So eventually I decided to put it online, and I designed some words, and I was working with Miguel. I think Miguel is here tonight. So I was like, Miguel, how about we animate some of these? So we just kind of I explained a little bit for him, each and every word. And we just did this little website, cascading page. Yeah, that's how it started. And I changed some of them throughout. Like, you know, sometimes I do an invite for a talk. I'd be like, oh, that's nice. I'm going to put that for the tea, change this. So I change them every now and then.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we need to have a word in English for that, I think, that smell. It sounds like, it's very specific, but I do know what you mean.
Now you're going to start to smell it. Now
okay, that'll be the next, the next event. We'll have to have a vote on the next, on that important word. Let's have some audience questions now. So this one came in from Wendy. Do you have any advice for how designers can make work that's more inclusive across alphabets and different languages?
I think the advice would be to work with what you know. So if you speak an alphabet, or your parents speak an alphabet, or perhaps you don't speak it but you're familiar with it a little bit, maybe this is a good place to start. And because that would be more true to who you are. So I wouldn't, although my designers, they both speak Chinese, I don't think I can learn Chinese, you know, that easily. Some languages are quite difficult to learn. If you want to take that on, it's a dedicated 3-4 year plan. I think, why not? Good for you. Go for it. But if the good place to start, or quick place to start, would be to start from what you know, what's around you, and then, you know, put some dedication there and then cross afterwards.
Amazing. This question's come from Nyanika. What are the challenges of creating a bilingual or a multilingual brand identity? I guess some of the unique challenges of creating that kind of brand identity.
So I think like so one of the things would be that you're sort of doing double the work, if not 2.5 of the work in a way, because you have to think of one language and then you have to translate that, or kind of think how is it going to work in the second language, and then what happens when they are together. So in the case of Arabic, for example, because you have a direction difference, you have right to left. If you're thinking of a website, for example, the next would look like the back button would look like the next button. You have no uppercase, the language is connected, so there's lots of difficulties. It's not perhaps too complicated if you're talking about English and French, because they're both kind of Latin-based, the script looks the same. So it depends really where is the kind of mixture. And I suppose sometimes it's also about thinking the one mark that ends up being used the most is the one that combines both languages. Unless you solve this in a naming way. For example, you use a name that links to one culture, and then you have a symbol that comes from another culture, or you use the type. So you kind of can use some of the assets of a brand identity to create this connection without necessarily having to have the two languages. So it can come into every single aspect of brand identity. And I suppose like you have to think of these relationships, so that makes the exercise longer and double the work in a way.
Next question comes from Deborah. How do you scale a creative business in today's competitive market?
It's a big question.
Tricky, big question, difficult question, yeah.
Scale a creative business in today's competitive market. I'm not sure, like I don't have an MBA or any of that. Like basically I set up a studio for 2 years before I joined Pentagram, and I've been winging it. So I'd say wing it. Scaling a creative business. It depends what you want to achieve. Is scale always the best thing? I think maybe, do you want to be big? Do you want to make a lot of money? Because a lot of people or a lot of founders that I've spoken to, they don't like it when they become very big, because they lose touch with the work it becomes more about growth. Aggressive growth means you're hiring very quickly. You may not be hiring the right people. It's not comfortable for the people you already have. So I don't think I've thought about this because it's never been something I wanted to do, scale like really quickly and go really big. I think I like small. I think I'm happy with that.
Yeah,
now.
I like that answer.
Yeah.
Maybe
so I didn't answer the question. Sorry, wrong person to ask it to.
I'm sorry, Deborah. I think a final question from Tyler. I think this is a joke, but it may not be. All I want in life is to be a pentagram partner. What? Could be completely serious.
All I want for Christmas is to be a pentagram partner.
What 3 things should I start doing to be one?
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily have to be 3, but some things, yeah.
Deborah? Is it Deborah?
This is Tyler.
Tyler. All right. Well, I'll tell you the quickest way to become a pentagram partner. But this stays in this room. You can bribe me. I accept cash, Visa, whatever payment method. That's the quickest way. We can talk after this talk. It's just,
there you go. It's only one thing, Tyler. It's actually really
thing.
simple. Yeah.
I don't know.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for those wonderful questions. Perhaps just a final question from me, because I think this is really at the heart of a lot of what you do. It does often feel like our world is becoming less open, less tolerant, which is so against what you stand for. What role do you think design can play in restoring trust, restoring tolerance between different communities, different countries? It's quite a big question to end with. I appreciate that.
This is a deep question. I mean, I don't think, you know, we're doing this and there's a background of news that is horrific that's coming out of Gaza, the genocide, children dying. I don't think we can answer this. I think the problem in the world we've created is the people we have in power. I think we have systems that do not represent us. They do not represent what we want. We have some bullies in power as well. And I don't feel like, in terms of like the pecking order of careers that sort of make a difference. If you want to make a difference with where we are, you want to be a politician or you want to be a lawyer who can build rules and regulations around what not to do and prosecute those who break them. Maybe doctors and nurses who maybe pick up the pieces of the pain that's being caused. I don't see, I mean, maybe this is a very bleak answer, but it's hard to pretend with this background today that design can make a big difference. We can definitely do campaigns, raise money for charity, but I'd like to see less pain caused for charities to come in and you know, help. You know, why are we still having wars? Why do we still have weapons like being used on such a mass level? I mean, maybe if we take away all the weapons, all the arms that are being sold in the world, and replace them with paintbrushes and pencils and papers, maybe a few laptops, if you want, some fonts, maybe, I don't know. Maybe that would be a nice image.
That's that's a nice reality. Like, I'd like that to be the case. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. But Samar, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.